Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi barakatuh, and welcome to another episode in the series, The Cross Questioned. And in this series, we have been looking at what actually took place on that Easter weekend as found in the pages of the Bible. We are limiting ourselves to the text of Christianity in this argument and in the study, because if we use any other text or any external evidence for the crucifixion, whether it took place or not, it will not be accepted by Christians. We cannot use any historical books, we cannot use any scientific books, we cannot use any archaeological books, or even any of the books written within Islam, because they will not accept these for whatever reason. So we have to limit ourselves within and to the pages of the Bible. And specifically, we are gaining most of the information from the New Testament, being the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So far, we have got to the point where the prophet Jesus Christ, according to Christianity, he's now been taken captive. He has been taken before the Jewish tribunal. He's been taken before the Romans. And he has been eventually handed over to the masses because both parties, both the Jewish and the Romans, both found no guilt in him. But by the pressure of politics, or we are led to believe in the Gospels, they gave over to the masses, and they eventually crucified, or I should say, placed the Messiah, or Jesus, or the substitute, onto a cross, or onto a tree, or onto a scaffold. We're not quite sure which of these three devices it was, because the biblical narrative is a bit vague on the topic. Anyway, we're now getting to the point where this person who is on the cross, according to Christianity and according to the Bible, it is Jesus himself. We have a different opinion to that. But we're having to stick within the pages of what they see it as. And so what does the text actually say? This is what we're looking at. And can the text be proved to be inaccurate, or is it an accurate portrayal of what actually happened? If that's the case, then the whole world has to actually look at the story and say, maybe they were right after all. So this is what we are doing at the moment. Now we've got to the book of Matthew. And in the book of Matthew, it speaks about what happened at that very moment. So the prophet Jesus, whoever it is, has now put his head down and he's breathed his last. And according to the narrative, he has died. And Matthew says from this point that at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn from the top to the bottom into two pieces. There was an earthquake, and the rocks and the graves opened, and many of God's saints were raised from their sleep and came out of their grave after the resurrection and entered into the holy city, where they were seen by many. And then there were centurions and other men who were keeping watch over Jesus, and when they saw the earthquakes and all that was happening, they were filled with awe, and they said, "Truly this man is the Son of God." This is Matthew chapter 27 from verse 51 to 54. In this narrative, there are a number of issues that we looked at last week that are problematic. First of all, the alleged case of the centurions and the men who saw all this happen then said, "Truly this man is the Son of God." They could only have said this if they had have gone forward in time and seen that the very text itself says only after Jesus was resurrected, these people then enter into the city, all these dead people that were walking around. So they couldn't have seen that at that time. So the only thing they could have seen at that time is Jesus dying and the rocks opening and earthquakes. But the dead had not raised yet, because the text itself says in verse 53 that this happened after Jesus had resurrected. The second problem with this is the word Son of God. Son of God has a double meaning, and it normally, well, actually in this text we don't know if it's a capital S and a capital G, so we don't know what he was saying, if it's the Son of God as the Romans used to refer to heroes at the time, or Son of God as being one of the many gods and son of that God, or whether it meant the Son of the all-powerful, almighty Allah. It's doubtful to which one of these it actually was referring to. I'm not going to go into the whole long story about Son of God, because we already did this last week. If you're wanting to find out about it, then you need to go and get a copy of last week's program, or review last week's program, where we went into great deal proving that the word Son of God had nothing to do with Allah when it's making this reference. Now Luke, in his version, gives a brief account of the same, more or less the same thing that happened, but adds the following. He says, "Then Jesus gave out a loud cry and said, 'Father, into your hands I commit my spirit.' And with that he died. And there was a centurion who saw all this, and he gave praise to God. Behold, the centurion said, 'This man was innocent.'" So this centurion in Luke's version doesn't say truly this man was the Son of God, or small g or small s, none of that, no confusion there. He simply says without a doubt this man was innocent, nothing about him being divine. And the verse continues in verse 48 of Luke chapter 23. It says, "The crowd who had assembled for the spectacle that happened then saw what happened and went home beating their breasts." So there's no zombies walking around, there's no earthquakes, there's no tremors, there's none of this type of stuff that you find in the earlier accounts in the other gospel. It's simply the people saw this, oh, it was a very bad day, beat their breasts and went home, hit themselves on the chest, in other words. Now, in fact, seeing all this that had happened, surely if we look at the accounts written by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, some of them have got earthquakes, zombies walking around, and all sorts of other things happening. Surely the whole of Jerusalem, after seeing these signs and wonders and hearing all this that had happened and wondered what is going on, there would have been an uprising. The people would have surrounded the high priest's courtyard and would have wanted his death for doing such a thing to this innocent man, or as some of them have said, the Son of God, or whatever words you would like to put in that the gospel writers could or could not have said regarding who this man was that was on the cross. Surely the whole of those people there would have realized, we do not want to be guilty of this, and would have immediately caused a riot and somehow trying to appease the Almighty by saying we were wrong, and so now we will make sure that the guilt is not on us. Remember that I had earlier said we want all the guilt on us and on the generations to come. But not a single thing happened. Not even one person went and rioted. So we find absolutely nothing happened. So this is a very odd thing to have occurred. And again, it tells you that perhaps the entire event didn't happen the way it was written. Now, the text continues to say, when we look at the text and we look at what happened in the different versions, many of the versions talk about how the prophet Isa, or how Jesus, or whoever the person was offered sour wine to drink, or offered vinegar mixed with myrrh, whatever it was, to drink before he dies. And the text says they offered Jesus something to drink, and many versions have different things. Some say it was a sponge with sour wine and so on. So the text that is used is said to have been fulfillment of a prophecy. People have often said, well, this was to fulfill a prophecy, which the scriptures said, "I thirst." So they took a prophecy or some word or one sentence in the Old Testament and it said, see, in the Old Testament, it fulfills a scripture which says, "I thirst." And so that one line is used as evidence that this is a credible instance that took place. It says in the New Testament, after this, Jesus, after all that had come to him, it was appointed to him to take the sour wine, which some versions say he rejected, some versions say he didn't. If we look in the King James Version, it doesn't talk about sour wine. It doesn't want to have wine associated with the prophet, so they say that it was vinegar. The New International Version says wine vinegar. Some of them say it was soaked with a sponge with wine fixed on a javelin, like the King James Version said was on a javelin. Others put it was on a hyssop. Some of them say it was on a stalk of a stick. Some say it was on a plant. Doesn't really matter what it is that the different versions say. But after this, when he received the wine, he said, "It is accomplished," or as some versions say, "It is finished." So in this specific instance, or this specific version of the story, it is held to his lips, having received the wine or whatever it was that was given to him, wine mixed with gall, whatever it is. He said, "It is accomplished," or "It is finished," and he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. This is what we find in John chapter 19, verse 28 to 30. But we know from previous versions that he refused to take this wine or whatever it was in the other versions. But John not being there, how do we know that John has not been there? Well, we found so many instances where he's been inaccurate already. First of all, the Prophet Isa or Jesus, whatever it is, during the trial period, he goes to the wrong place at the wrong time. He's got 4 days missing from the entire narrative. He also talks about how Peter was warming himself around a charcoal fire with all the other people that were there in the courtyard. We've already said that imagine having a barbecue, you can barely warm yourself up in front of a barbecue. It had to be a proper flaming fire. And so there's all these inaccuracies that he has. So even in this we can see more than probably he was not in that area. So he has no understanding of what was happening. So he's writing from his own perspective. So he misses out the entire storyline when he writes it in John chapter 19, verse 28 to 30. Well, we have to take a break, and when we get back from the break, we will continue, inshallah.
Dhikr for the heart like water for the fish.
Establish Salah at home.
The dividing line between Islam and apostasy is the Salah, the prayer.
Imbibe Islamic etiquettes and manners.
Telling lies, backbiting, slandering, zero tolerance we should have at home.
Learn to be the best husband or wife.
You love what your beloved one loves, and you hate what your beloved one hates.
Create an invigorating Islamic environment.
Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is the best husband in the history of humanity.
Join Salim Al-Amri in The Muslim House every Saturday at 4:30 p.m. and repeat telecast at 2 a.m. India on Peace TV. Spreading awareness.
If you go way back to the time of the Prophet ﷺ, we find that the companions, they differed, but the difference was not in clashing and fighting.
Why this issue is so controversial today in Islam.
Promoting righteousness.
All the four scholars themselves, they said, if you find a hadith that goes against my saying, then you take the hadith.
Once the concept is understood, I think many problems will be solved.
Emphasizing God's message of peace for humankind.
Never take as a close, intimate friend except a mu'min.
The one who has the taqwa, or the truthful,
Uplifting our faith and good deeds.
Patience in the obedience of Allah. Patience in abstaining from that which is haram. The greater the reward is in this life and the hereafter.
Grasp the opportunity to enhance your knowledge of Islam in Islamic Viewpoint. Every Wednesday and Saturday at 11:30 p.m. and repeat telecast at 12:30 p.m. India on Peace TV.
Most countries of the world ban bullying. They fight it in their schools and universities. A lot of us are being bullied differently every single day. Some come up to us and say, do this, while others say, don't you dare. Some say this is halal, while others say, nope, this is haram. Are you confused? Do you feel lost? Join me in Umdat al-Ahkam, where with the grace of Allah, we will learn the proper knowledge from the Quran and from the Sunnah, which would help stop this kind of bullying.
Join Asim Al-Hakim in Umdatul Ahkam, next on Peace TV.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back. We're continuing in our series, The Cross-Questioned. And before the break, we were talking about how we saw in John's version that he does not go into a huge detail in the story, which he normally does in many of his other narrations of what's happening compared to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This time, John actually holds himself back, and we said probably because he couldn't find any prophecy to manipulate that would fit into what he was saying, and so he knew that his Gentile audience probably would not believe it without some type of prophecy. Also, he had used so much exaggeration before in so many of the other parts of his book that people probably thought, okay, well, if he had have done this as well, it would have just been an overkill, and they'd probably be less likely to accept or believe his story. Remember, he had already made himself best friends with the Son of God and the Mother of God, and that was enough for what he needed, and that was enough for his theology. But he does add some other color to the story. So he doesn't go the whole way into that, but he does add to what happens at the crucifixion scene and the death and the rock splitting open, things like that, as the other books do. But he does add his own little bit of flavor here because he can't pass a good thing by. So he adds the following: because it was the evening of the Sabbath, or the evening of the Passover, some versions add the day of preparation, or Friday in the Passover, depending on which version you read. And it continues to say that the Jews were anxious that the body should not remain on the cross for the coming of the Sabbath, since the Sabbath was a day of great seriousness to them. So they requested to Pilate to have the legs broken and that the body should then be taken down. And so the narration says that the soldiers accordingly came to the first of his fellow victims. Remember, there are two people crucified on either side of him, and to the second, and broke their legs. And then they came to Jesus and found that he is already dead, so they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers stabbed him in the side with a javelin or a lance, depends which version you read, and there was out of his side blood and water that flowed. And this you can read in John chapter 19, verse 31 to 34. So in this instance, we have the explanation given that when they came to Jesus, they found that he was already dead. And so they didn't break his legs. But the soldier, to make sure that he was actually dead, takes a javelin or a lance and stabs him in the side to see if there's going to be any reaction. If he moves, I mean, if you were stabbed, you would move. And of course, there is no reaction, and blood and water flows according to the text. Sure enough, John has to try to find not just one prophecy to match this event, but he manages to pull out of his hat two prophecies that fulfill this event. And he says in John chapter 19, verse 36 to 37, this all happened to fulfill the text of the scripture, which would say, no bone of his shall be broken. The exact quote is, no bone of his shall be broken. The other text says, that he quotes as a fulfilling of prophecy, they shall look on him whom they pierced. So he takes these two lines out of a prophecy and says that they fit into the prophecies that will here be fulfilled with Jesus being crucified and dying on the cross. So let's move on a little bit further in the text that we're looking at now. The burial is what we are at now. Jesus has already died, he's been crucified, we've looked at all the inconsistencies and the errors there. But now let's move on a little further. We're looking to the period now where the body needs to come off the cross, or come off the tree, or come off the scaffolding, wherever it was put on, and now going to take the body down. Remember, in the text we've just looked at, they went and said, we want to take the body down. We don't want to leave it there over the Sabbath or over this period of time. So the text continues to say that by this time evening had come, and it was preparation day, as it says in Mark chapter 16. So this is the day before the Sabbath. Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council of men who looked forward to the kingdom of God, bereaved, he went to Pilate and he asked if he could have the body of Jesus. Now Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. So he sent for the centurions and he asked them whether or not Jesus was in fact dead. And when he heard that the centurions had reported that he was in fact dead, then he gave Joseph leave or permission to take the body down, or to take Jesus' body. So Joseph bought a linen sheet, took him down from the cross and wrapped him in the sheet. Then he laid him in a tomb cut out of a rock and rolled a big stone across the entrance. and Mary of Magdala and Mary the mother of Joseph were watching and saw all that was happening, or where he was laid. Now, Matthew reports that Joseph, a man of Arimathea, was a man of means. In other words, he was a wealthy man and had himself become a disciple of the prophet Jesus. So he does not mention the confirmation of Jesus' death by the centurion in his account. But what is interesting to note is, according to Matthew, that this man, he was a disciple of Jesus. And so he goes and he has the body taken down, and he looks after this body, or takes the body to wherever it's going to go. As we will listen to now in Matthew chapter 27, verse 59 to 61. And it says, "Then Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen sheet, and laid it on his own unused tomb, which he had cut out of the rock. Then he rolled a large stone across the entrance and went away. Mary of Magdala was there, and the other Mary, sitting opposite the grave." So this is his account that we find there. Luke calls Joseph a member of a council, a good, upright man who had good policies and actions that he had taken in his life. So he speaks about him in a very positive way. This man now, according to this version that we are going to look at, says, this man now approached Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. This is in Luke's version. Taking it down from the cross, he wrapped it in white linen and laid it in a tomb, cut out of a rock, in which no one had laid before. It was Friday, and the Sabbath was about to begin. And the woman who accompanied Jesus, or whoever it was, from Galilee followed, and took note of the tomb and observed how the body was laid. This is Luke chapter 23, verse 52 to 55. And so we can always count, when we're looking at Matthew, Mark, and Luke's version that we've looked at, pretty much the same, very little difference between them. Maybe one has a little bit more than the other, one says one thing or the other. But we can always count on good old John to bring in extra material into his version and to his account. And his account says that after that, Pilate was approached by Joseph of Arimathea, a disciple of Jesus, but a secret disciple, because he was afraid of the Jews, who asked to be allowed to remove the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave him the permission, so Joseph came and took the body away. He was joined by Nicodemus, the man who had first visited Jesus by night earlier on in the biblical record, who brought with him a mixture of myrrh and aloes, more than 100 weight, it says in the Bible. Then they took the body of Jesus and wrapped it with the different spices and strips of linen cloth, according to the Jewish burial custom. Now in that place where he was crucified, there was a garden. And in that garden there was a new tomb, not yet used for burial purposes, because the tomb was near at hand, and that was the evening for the Sabbath. So they laid Jesus in that tomb, as found in John chapter 19, verse 38 to 42. So let's leave aside the character of Joseph of Arimathea. We need to note that, first of all, Pilate himself was surprised when he was told that Jesus was already dead. He was surprised, so he sends for the guards because he doesn't believe that this has actually happened. The Synoptic Gospels mention only Joseph, but John, in his version, he brings in Nicodemus as well, along with his 100 weight of mixture of myrrh and aloes. The two of them wrap up Jesus' body in strips of linen cloth, according to Jewish burial customs, he said. Joseph wraps Jesus' body in new or a clean sheet of linen, and no strips according to Matthew, Mark, Luke. So John says strips, Matthew, Mark, Luke says it's a new clean sheet of linen. Now Joseph does not give the ceremonial bath that is the custom and tradition of both the Jews and Muslims. Joseph does not go and wash the body. Nicodemus too, even if he was supposedly there, did not give the ceremonial bath, as is a custom before burying a body or even wrapping it. being a good Jew, he would have been trying to bury the person in the best Jewish customs without giving any excuses for people to come and complain about the way he looked after the Messiah's body. But being a good Jew and a pious Jew without giving a ceremonial bath would be unthinkable, just as it is in Islam. So the tomb was nearby, according to John specifically, and it was freshly dug out. But Mark and Matthew mention only 2 Marys, but Luke says Mary who had accompanied him from Galilee, so he leaves out the other Mary. John mentions no witnesses at all,